this is ridiculous. Think about this for a while. This is insanity. Really? We want to protect our life on the world by threatening to blow us up?
Welcome to VoiceOver. I'm your host, Heather Bigley, and for years I talked to people about the movies they should watch, and now I'm talking with people about the movies they did watch, and that made a mark. Sometimes it's not the movie you'd expect. Today's movie is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It's a satire from Stanley Kubrick, 1964. The film is considered one of the funniest movies America has ever made, and most people remember it for the scene when Slim Pickens, yes, that's the actor's name, as Major King Kong, rides the nuclear bomb out of the B-52 missile bay and through the air, which sets off a chain reaction of nuclear explosions, all set to the popular 1930s ballad, We'll Meet Again. Or maybe you've heard people cryptically repeating precious bodily fluids. That's a line from the crazed American general Ripper, who set the whole nuclear crisis in motion because he was afraid the Soviets had been fluoridating the American water supply. Or maybe you've heard about Peter Sellers playing 3 roles in this film: British Captain Mandrake, U.S. President Merkin Muffley, and Dr. Strangelove himself. All to say, it's a classic that, according to our guest today, is more pertinent than ever. My guest today is James Patrick Thomas, the author of Atomic Pilgrim: How Walking Thousands of Miles for Peace Led to Uncovering Some of America's Darkest Nuclear Secrets, published in 2025. He serves on Pax Christi's USA's Disarmament Working Group and facilitates the Pax Christi chapter at Joseph Parish in Seattle. Stick around after the conversation for more recommends.
Probably in the 70s would have been the first time I would have watched it. I was a bit of a movie buff back then. My undergraduate degree is in theater and broadcasting, and I spent the first 4 years out of college as a broadcast engineer, doing the technical kinds of things behind the scenes. In the 70s, we lived in Spokane, and just west of Spokane is Fairchild Air Force Base. And at the time, it had both B-52s, which factor very heavily into the movie, but also KC-135 aerial refueling tankers, which also is portrayed in the movie. And anybody in the United States growing up during the Cold War was certainly aware of the possibility of a nuclear war. I mean, I remember having nightmares as a kid. That's how real it was. But in the late 70s and especially in the early 1980s, that got even more palpable. I knew friends of mine who were starting families at the age, I should say, of starting families. And many of those couples were making the decision not to have children because they didn't want their kids to experience a nuclear war.
I grew up in Maryland. My stepdad worked at Andrews Air Force Base there outside of DC. And I remember, school drills where we would get under our desks in case there was a nuclear attack. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, I remember feeling like, oh, I guess I could plan for the rest of my life now. Because it seemed like before that, everything was just going to end. And why would you plan for the future? So talk to me about, you just rewatched the film. What did you notice, or were there anything that changed for you or stuck out to you on this rewatch? Yeah.
Huge. The original Dr. Strangelove, premiered in 1964. I was absolutely astounded by how much detail that certainly back in the 50s would have been classified information. and perhaps was still classified when the film was put out. But I was amazed at how prophetic it was. And here's why. So in 1964, they talk about the Soviets building a doomsday machine. 20 years later, the Soviets did build a doomsday machine and had it operational by 1985. And I know that because it's uh, described in this book called The Dead Hand by David E. Hoffman. And he won the Pulitzer Prize that year for his book because of the end of the Cold War. There was a lot more access to Soviet era files. There was a Russian commander who in 2011 made a pretty explicit admission that it was still operational. It would allow lower echelon Russian military people to essentially send this series of rockets that they would fly across Russian territory and send launch messages to Russian ICBM silos to launch a retaliatory strike at the United States. Living with nuclear deterrence now all my life, I see even more so now that the era of arms control is certainly ended for now. Hopefully, it will come back and very soon. But the tensions between Russia and the West over the Russian invasion of Ukraine is increasing tensions throughout Western Europe. It's not far to imagine that we could be in a very serious crisis within a matter of days.
For me, I thought about the Star Wars program that Reagan had wanted to institute.
We've spent, I can't remember how many hundreds of billions of dollars since 1983 when Reagan announced Star Wars or the Strategic Defensive Initiative, SDI. And we've had an operational system in Alaska and I think California. And then at the start of President Trump's second term, he announced Golden Dome,
Right.
which is an expansion of Star Wars. It will be hugely expensive, but probably not any more effective or protective as Star Wars.
Do you feel like this film contributed at all to your awareness or your calling to work for disarmament?
It probably did in general, but my specific conversion, if you will, to nuclear disarmament activism happened in the fall of 1981 when I saw a pantomime that four Seattle area women had developed. And it was called 4 Minutes to Midnight, hearkening back to the Doomsday Clock by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I think the reason why that particular bit of theater had more of a impact on me, say, than Dr. Strangelove or any of the other movies surrounding this fear or threat of a nuclear war had made on me previously is that as a pantomime, there were no words. Without words, my mind was kind of disconnected. And I had to grapple with what was being portrayed in that theater on an emotional level. And I realized the insanity of our preparations for nuclear war, that this policy of nuclear deterrence or mutual assured destruction policy, or the balance of power, or however you want to countenance it, are all kind of intellectual, verbal ways of rationalizing something that is inherently irrational. As I watched these women portray the seriousness of us preparing for nuclear war, I felt deeply how much at risk, not just my life or the life of my family, but all that we hold in amazement at the beauty and the variety of human life, the richness of our arts, and the mystery of loving, either loving our God or loving each other, loving creation. I just said, I've got to do something. And I was depressed for 2 weeks with this heaviness. And as a good Catholic, I went to see a priest, Father Jack Morris, a Jesuit here in Seattle. And he said, Jim, you've got to do something for peace. It's the only way out of the depression, of your sense of powerlessness. He had the idea of about a year before, of this Bethlehem peace pilgrimage, of walking to Bethlehem for peace. People who had been Jesuit volunteers, lay volunteers, the year before I was, had started to already work on organizing this. And so I had the opportunity to jump right in and help them finish organizing it. And about 6 months later, we left the gates of the Trident nuclear submarine base across Puget Sound from Seattle on this trek across the United States and 9 other countries to Bethlehem. It took us 20 months. It was an absolute joy and awesome, once in a lifetime adventure.
I think it's interesting that this pantomime was so affecting for you. And part of the reason is how different it is from the style of the film we're talking about. Dr. Strangelove is a satire, and there are so many things that are played for laughs, right? That are pushed as humorous. When you watch the satire, do you feel like this is an appropriate way to discuss topic that is, I mean, it's so important for us to wrap our minds around?
They're taking this thing that's usually portrayed as very rational, very sensible, and by using satire of saying, this is ridiculous. Think about this for a while. This is insanity. Really? We want to protect our life on the world by threatening to blow us up? That's not, doesn't make any sense. It's not practical. So, the only people that really win are the defense contractors and the stockholders of those defense companies. That's who really wins in an arms race. We've got to get on back on the road to peace and disarmament and building up multilateral ways of government such that we are able to learn from each other, build up trust among countries, focus on human development to make it so that every one of the human family around the world has what it needs for their realization of their fulfillment.
Yeah. How do we support human integrity and sort of the image of the divine in humans if we're sending our tax dollars to a system that will just destroy us all,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So maybe this isn't the right time to ask the question, but do you laugh when you watch this movie? Because there were a couple moments when I laughed. Though I don't do great with satire. I'm always like, hey, but I do laugh in this movie.
Well, I think Peter Sellers is a treasure.
Yes.
And for him to be portraying three very different characters in the film and seeing really the delight he takes in this challenge is
Yes.
amazing. But then you have George Scott
Yes.
who takes on this kind of gung ho American general and is so enraptured with this gung ho ness that he catches himself a couple of times in the film and comes to see the insanity of this whole enterprise.
He is so excited that the toys that he's been building might get played with,
Mhm.
right? And wants to see what they can do. I have to say, one of my favorite lines from the movie is when George C. Scott says,
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
which just to me is funny and horrible and kind of points to our fears in the audience of how the people in charge actually think of our lives, right?
Yeah.
Like we're just fodder for some great fun adventure for them that they haven't thought all the way through, that they too will be, killed.
I'm reminded of a situation that Daniel Ellsberg describes in his memoir. Daniel Ellsberg, for people, was the one that released the Pentagon Papers that blew apart the government's rationale for the Vietnam War. But Ellsberg didn't just make copies of the Pentagon Papers. He also made copies of documents he had access to and helped develop when he worked at the Rand Corporation in the 50s and 60s about planning for nuclear war. The early estimates were hundreds of millions of people would die. And yet we kept going on and going on and going on and saying, to the public, don't worry, we've got this under control when they had no control over it at all. And my work on Hanford, after I got back from the pilgrimage, and the research I did into the secret documents of plutonium production at the Hanford site in South Central Washington State, you could see the madness of the arms race in the amount of plutonium that Hanford was being asked to produce, with more environmental contamination, more human exposure to radiation releases. And it just got to an insane level, really insane level in the 50s and 60s, to the point where when Lyndon Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination, came in, and within 2 months basically put a kibosh on it. It started up again in 1983 with President Reagan. He wanted more plutonium, so Hanford was restarted. That's how I began doing my research and investigations into the Hanford operations. Within 6 years, myself and others, both here in Washington State, but also with national environmental groups, we got plutonium processing and production stopped in 1990, over a year before the Soviet Union collapsed.
What was that like when you heard that they were going to stop?
Just a couple weeks before that announcement by the US government that it was ending plutonium production. My mom had been killed by a drunk driver,
Oh.
and I was in the midst of grief. I couldn't celebrate, I couldn't take any satisfaction. And the reality, even after I had, gone into counseling and gone through the process of grieving and building my life back up after that devastation, it didn't change the number of nuclear weapons. We still had the peril of nuclear war. And as we do today,
We both talked about what it was like to see the end of the Cold War, and that during the Cold War we had this tension and pressure that was sort of around us in society. I would say most people don't necessarily feel that about nuclear armament anymore. And I would say that most of the younger generation doesn't know that much about nuclear armament. But at the same time, it seems like Dr. Strangelove as a warning has become necessary again, right? Or maybe it's not Dr. Strangelove. Maybe it's another movie that someone makes for a younger generation. But if you were going to recommend Dr. Strangelove to someone, what would you say to them about it?
I would say this was a dramatic portrayal of the madness of the Cold War. Just seeing, one of the great directors, and also the professionalism of Sellers and Scott. And it speaks to people who, have that same love of artistry. My hope is that people now and younger generations will listen to their hearts and use their love of these beautiful arts as a way of expressing the human desire for stability, security, and peace. To trust those feelings deep inside of us and then give them expression. And I think that's how we save humanity.
Thanks to Jim for talking to me. His background and knowledge are a great way to approach Dr. Strangelove. Jim actually recommended 2 documentaries to me, including Atomic People, available on PBS, about the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and An Ordinary Insanity, a short documentary which features Daniel Ellsberg, imploring us to reduce nuclear armament. I'd love to recommend at this point a bunch of satires to you, but American audiences generally have trouble with satire, as do I. Namely, it's a form that pushes the boundaries of what we hold as normal, rational, good, even sacred, in order to get us to evaluate whether our institutions or systems or mores are good and sacred, or whether we've just accepted the status quo, a status quo that might crush the people and grind the poor. This means that satires can feel grotesque and uncomfortable and offensive. A recent example of this is Jojo Rabbit, which came out in 2019 and is about a young boy in Nazi Germany whose imaginary best friend was Adolf Hitler. You can imagine a lot of people found this film offensive. Maybe they felt like only Mel Brooks is really allowed to joke about the Nazis, as he did in his 1967 satire, The Producers. I think Jojo Rabbit deserves a look, and you might be surprised at how the film borrows from Beatlemania to capture the public's adulation of Hitler, including a German version of I Want to Hold Your Hand on the soundtrack. Some people argue that Pixar's WALL-E from 2008 is a satire, and they might be right after we experience the first 45 minutes, which is really a gorgeous ode to the need for connection and love. We do land in satiric territory on the spaceship with the residents there zooming about on motorized couches, sipping unlimited sodas. They look less like intergalactic refugees and more like early retirees on a celebrity Caribbean cruise. The film asks us whether our need for convenience is more important than our need for relationship. Director Andrew Stanton wanted WALL-E to draw upon the sci-fi classics of the 1970s, so he created digital strategies for the film's cinematography in order to include shallow focus, the barrel distortion of 70mm, lens flare, and rack focus. Lastly, you should check out The Great McGinty from 1940. I've already recommended Preston Sturges' The Lady Eve, and The Great McGinty has the same smarts, but this time Sturges trains his laser focus on local politics. Brian Donlevy is a down-and-out drifter who ends up becoming the face of a political campaign that eventually makes him governor. Another performance to love is from William Demarest, who will eventually become Uncle Charlie in the popular 1960s TV show My Three Sons. It's a film that asks, who's really in charge in America, and do you have the stomach to find out? Reportedly, Sturges sold the story to Paramount Pictures for $10 because he really wanted the right to direct the film. That's our show today. Voiceover is a production of BYU Radio and is edited by Spencer Boyer with additional post-production support from Ashton Rowan and Nick Levitt. I'm your host, Heather Bigley.